In central New Jersey, on an early morning in October 2021, the suburban neighborhood of Holmdel seemed peaceful and sleepy. People were rushing to work, school buses were picking up children, and nothing seemed to portend trouble. It was here that something incredible and frightening happened that made the blood run cold. The story of a woman who was the victim of a terrible betrayal in her own home, but somehow miraculously managed to survive. The woman's name was Rachel Sanders, and for the past 2 years, her life had not been easy. Married to James Sanders, a powerful businessman from Red Bank, she seemed from the outside to be a model wife. But in reality, their relationship had long been soured. James had a fiery and controlling temper, and those who knew the couple closely guessed that Rachel had long been his hostage. Her entourage noted that she had changed, was depressed, and often avoided questions about her family. Toward October, James was increasingly absent from work. His real estate business was making him money but surrounded him with a shadow of suspicion. Some of his deals were on the edge of the law, and he was constantly nervous, especially lately. The Sanders' financial situation had deteriorated, adding fuel to the fire of an already strained relationship. Rachel began to think about divorce, although she realized that James would not let her go so easily. So, one cold October evening, when the streets of Holmdel were empty, Rachel waited for James at home. She was preparing for a frank conversation, but she didn't know that her husband had already made a decision that would change her life forever. When James returned, he was unaccustomedly silent, his eyes cold, as if he was already planning something. That night, he got her drunk on wine, stronger than usual, and after waiting until she started to fall asleep, he sprang into action. Rachel woke up in the dark and felt that her hands and feet were bound tightly. Her body was breaking, and she couldn't understand what had happened. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness a little, she saw that she was lying in a metal container, with soft, wet soil falling from above. James, tugging at the soil, was burying her alive. When she was completely buried, Rachel began to gasp for air, but miraculously she managed to find a small pocket of air. Her mind was foggy from the lack of oxygen, but her will to survive was stronger. She realized that she had a chance if she managed to get out or at least attract attention. For long hours, she tried to free her hands, slowly loosening the ropes until she finally loosened the knot on one of her arms. With great difficulty, she began to move toward the surface, punching through the dense layer of earth with her hands. When Rachel managed to get out, it was still dark. She realized she was far from home, but she couldn't remember how far James had taken her. Rachel crawled out onto the road and, with her last strength, reached for the phone she miraculously still had in her pocket, making a call to 911. Her voice was weak, but operators were able to get her location and dispatched police and an ambulance. When police officers arrived on the scene, they were shocked by her condition. Rachel was covered in mud, emaciated, and could barely stand. She was taken to the hospital where she was able to give a statement. Police immediately advanced to James's home. Within hours of Rachel being taken to the hospital, Holmdel was immersed in the shock of the horrifying story, which soon became known to the police and local reporters. Officers immediately began searching for James Sanders, knowing that every hour gave him time to escape. Given his connections and financial situation, law enforcement realized that he could have fled the state or even the country if he had prepared such a plan in advance. The events of that night led police to throw everything they had into apprehending the perpetrator, realizing that procrastination could have denied them the opportunity to bring him to justice. When the operatives arrived at the Sanders mansion, they found the house empty, but not completely. There were traces of wine stains on the kitchen table and a couple of broken glasses. There was still a slight odor of alcohol and something metallic in the air, as if the house had recently been worked on with tools. The police began searching every corner, and it soon became clear that James had left in a hurry. There were scattered belongings in the bedroom, and his office showed signs that he had recently tried to delete some files and documents. Toward morning, detectives received information from neighbors that late at night someone had seen James's car heading north toward the Garden State Parkway. Police officers began tracking his recent credit card transactions and soon learned that he had filled up at a gas station near Cheesequake Park, about 30 miles from their home in Holmdel. This information led police officers to speculate that James was traveling north, possibly toward the New York state border. In parallel, a team of forensic experts conducted a thorough search of the site where Rachel had been buried alive. The vast area in a remote part of the woods was difficult to access, and if not for Rachel's determination, her remains might never have been found. A shovel was found at the site, still fresh rut tracks and boot prints that led to the burial site. Police officers carefully recorded and collected all the evidence, realizing that every detail was critical to the future investigation and trial. The shovel with the fingerprints James left on the surface and the shoe prints matching his size were the first direct evidence against him. Soon, information about James's attempted murder and escape was fed into state and FBI databases, allowing a massive search to be organized. Agents were able to obtain surveillance footage from a gas station where James was recorded. He was filling up, had a quick bite to eat at a roadside cafe, and soon left the place at high speed. In parallel, homicide detectives continued to gather information about James and Rachel's personal lives to look for possible leads and motives. Rachel's former co-workers reported that their relationship with her husband had always been strained. Rachel repeatedly complained of controlling and emotional pressure from James. One of her friends admitted to the police that a week before the incident, she had mentioned her intention to file for divorce and prepare the documents, which James had probably become aware of. This fact became a serious clue and explained a possible motive for him to take such a drastic step. Meanwhile, James Sanders continued to go into hiding. His car was found abandoned in a park near a cabin belonging to an old acquaintance of his who was on vacation. When the police searched the cabin, they found remnants of food and signs of presence, but James himself was not present. He had apparently left the place realizing that his location could be traced. While the police searched the house and the cabin for clues, Rachel, lying in hospital, was able to give more details of the events that took place on the night of the attack. She described how James first let her drink more wine than usual, and then, when she began to fall asleep, put her in the car and drove her to the middle of nowhere. According to her, he had been calm, even cold-blooded. Rachel recalled that as she came to her senses in the grave, she heard the sound of his footsteps moving away from her, followed by complete silence. The combination of her story and physical evidence allowed police to build a picture of what happened. The investigation also revealed another interesting fact. Over the past few months, James had been actively transferring money from his accounts to unknown accounts registered to offshore companies. This appeared to be preparations for a getaway, suggesting he was consciously planning a crime. Police found remnants of receipts and letters from unknown lawyers in his office, further indicating he was trying to organize his life on the run in advance. Meanwhile, public attention to the case was growing. Local media began to cover the story in detail, and James Sanders' name quickly gained notoriety. New details emerged every day, and the city held its breath, waiting to see how the investigation would conclude. After Rachel Sanders' story spread in the press, the police began receiving numerous reports from citizens who claimed to have seen James in various parts of the state and even out of state. Most of these turned out to be false trails or mere rumors. However, one report drew particular attention. An anonymous caller reported that a similar man had been spotted near Cape May in one of the small motels located in a secluded area on the outskirts of town. A team of detectives from Holmdel immediately went to the location, checking all possible leads. Upon arrival, detectives quickly determined that the man reported in the call was not James, but a local resident. While interviewing the motel staff, one of the employees recalled that someone resembling James had actually stayed here a few days ago, but had already left the motel. Fingerprints left in the room confirmed it was James, but the detectives were only a few hours late. He managed to get away again. Going back to analyze his movements, investigators concluded that James was likely using public transportation and hiding in crowded places, trying not to draw attention to himself. His transfers to offshore accounts and attempts to hide suggested that he was planning to flee the country. Police soon discovered that James may have turned to forged documents, using them to cross the border. At this time, Rachel's condition stabilized and she was able to give additional testimony. She recalled that James kept his passport and some important documents in a special metal box hidden in their garage, which he used only for international travel. This information was critical because it suggested his plans to travel abroad. However, the box turned out to be missing, which confirmed investigators' speculation. The FBI became involved in the case, believing that James might be on his way to Mexico, where the forged documents would be easier to use. In turn, New Jersey police set up surveillance at key transportation hubs and began checking camera footage at train stations and bus terminals, tracing whether he might have taken one of the flights south. Events began to unfold with renewed vigor when James was spotted on a surveillance camera at a bus terminal in Newark. Video footage showed him buying a bus ticket bound for Washington, D.C. Investigators speculated he was using the capital city as a staging area before heading south. Officers contacted colleagues in D.C. to be ready for his arrival and set up surveillance at the train station in hopes of apprehending him when he arrived. The bus arrived early in the morning, and the detectives were ready to detain James on the spot, but he managed to fool them again. It turned out that he had gotten off the bus at an intermediate stop in Baltimore, where he had taken a room at a cheap hotel. The police immediately went to the scene, but when they arrived, it turned out that James was there for a short time and again managed to escape. This time, empty grocery packages were found in the room, as well as a plan of Baltimore City, scribbled and labeled with notes. This led investigators to believe he was hatching a new plan. The situation was becoming increasingly tense. Time was running out, and the pressure from the public and the press was mounting. All of New Jersey was watching the news, waiting for the arrest of the man who almost killed his wife. Investigators began working with Border Patrol agents to prevent him from crossing the border. During this time, James attempted another step. He contacted a former acquaintance of his from New York who dealt in forged documents. Agents monitoring James's contacts got wind of this and realized that he may have been looking for new documents to conceal his identity. The cops began scouring possible addresses where underground organizations involved in document fraud might be located. A few days later, when it seemed that James had literally vanished into thin air, they received a report from a former police informant about a possible deal to sell a fake passport that the buyer was going to use to leave New York. Detectives advanced to the location where the meeting was supposedly to take place. Detectives arrived at the location of the fake passport transaction on the outskirts of New York City. The informant reported that James was willing to pay a large sum of cash for documents that would allow him to leave the country. The meeting place was extremely well chosen for the discreet exchange, an abandoned warehouse in the East Bronx, surrounded by deserted streets and old freight docks. The hijacking operation was elaborate. Several undercover FBI agents positioned themselves around the warehouse to block possible escape routes. Police patrols disguised themselves as random passers-by and ostensibly maintenance crews, so as not to draw attention to the operation. As James approached the warehouse, his movements were visible on the cameras set up by the agents. Inside, he met with a counterfeiter who presented him with identification. James carefully checked his passport and visas, clearly aware that any slip in the paperwork could give him away at the border. The moment for the arrest was chosen when James left his bag of money on the table. As soon as the transaction was completed and he had the documents in his hands, the agents rushed inside, immobilizing him and the forger. James tried to resist, but the forces were unequal. Minutes later, he was handcuffed and taken to a New York City police station for questioning. At the station, James initially refused to speak. He demanded a lawyer and denied his guilt, claiming he was being pursued by mistake. But detectives were already armed with ample evidence, including camera footage, witness statements, proof of the purchase of a fake passport, and forensic evidence linking him to the crime. But the key element that made his position hopeless was the surviving victim, his wife, Rachel, who could now personally confirm that he was the one who had buried her alive. During the interview, the detectives did not immediately start with the main accusation. They let James speak, trying to understand his train of thought. He talked about mistakes in the investigation, about Rachel turning everyone against him, mentioned financial problems, and even claimed that she might have staged the attack herself to get insurance and leave him in debt. But once he was shown crime scene photos and camera footage, his confidence began to fade. He tried to justify himself, saying he couldn't remember the details of the day, that perhaps something happened in a fit of anger. This statement was key to the investigation because it almost sounded like a confession. After hours of questioning, James finally broke down. He admitted that the attack took place against the backdrop of a serious quarrel with Rachel, but claimed that he had not intended to kill her. He asserted that he had just wanted to teach her a lesson, but that at some point the situation had gotten out of hand. James described how they drove out of town to sort things out once and for all. He stopped the car, ostensibly to get her to admit her guilt, but eventually, driven to a state of passion, he struck her several times, then panicked and covered her with earth. James claimed he thought she was dead, and that was the only reason he decided to hide the body without thinking of the consequences. At the trial, James kept a cold and detached demeanor. His attorneys based their defense on the defendant's unstable mental state, claiming that he acted out of passion. The defense insisted that it was a random attack, not a premeditated murder. However, the prosecutor, relying on medical evidence about Rachel's condition after discovery, insisted that James had purposely tried to kill her to avoid divorce and financial obligations. Rachel's survivor testified, describing how she fought for her life the moment she realized the ground was beginning to cover her body. Her testimony made a strong impression on the jury as her story was full of pain and strength at the same time. Physical evidence, camera footage, and Rachel's testimony led to a guilty verdict within a week. James was found guilty of attempted first-degree aggravated murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. This story became widely publicized, bringing attention to the issues of domestic violence and the possibility of its fatal consequences. Rachel, after going through numerous surgeries and recovery, became involved in community activism, helping other victims of abuse and advocating for reforms in the justice system. So ended the story of a brutal crime that took place in the silence of the New Jersey woods. But its echoes reverberated long afterward, changing the lives of those affected by the tragedy.